Hey, FFR listeners. If you love getting to listen in on our convos each week, consider helping us keep bringing our signature brand of feminist pop culture analysis to you by joining our Patreon community at patreon.com/femfreak. You can get early access, exclusive bonus episodes, participate in AMAs, join our friendly Discord server, and more. That's patreon.com/femfreak. See you there. Our education systems, our cultural narratives fail us and don't really help us feel connected to bigger things. And science fiction and maybe time travel narratives in particular can kind of, in some ways, fill that gap and open our eyes to the ways in which we are part of these larger struggles that have been going on for who knows how long.
Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio. This is the show that asks you to be critical of the media you love. I'm Anita Sarkeesian, and I'm joined by my very own personal Doc Brown, Carolyn Pettit.
Anita, we've got to get you back to 1985.
Oh, today we're going to be diving into time travel, if you couldn't have guessed that. And prompting this super exciting topic is our very special guest, Annalee Newitz. Hey.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you. I'm going to awkwardly tell people about you while you're listening. If you aren't familiar with Annalee, they are an author and a journalist, contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, and the founding editor of IO9. They have a new book coming out called Future of Another Timeline, which uncoincidentally is all about feminism and time travel. I also want to shout out your podcast, Our Opinions Are Correct, with author Charlie Jane Anders, because it's so wonderful and smart.
Oh, thanks.
Every time I listen to it, I'm like, wow, we shouldn't have a podcast because theirs is better than ours.
First of all, that's not true. Second of all, I'm glad that the mind control ray is working. And
Sure,
I
totally.
feel like you're falling in line exactly as we hoped. So that's good.
But yeah, it's just, I love, like, it's so, you're both so extremely well educated. It's about like science and genre and science fiction. And like, it's constantly giving me different ways of thinking about like the media like that I love and engage with all the time. There was an episode I listened to about camp recently that I was like, oh, I don't know anything about this. And it was just so, I loved it. And I don't say that easily because I don't actually listen to a lot of podcasts.
It's true. Anita hates pretty much everything. So when she says she likes your thing, like, it's a big deal.
I feel super excited. Yeah, no, it's really a pleasure to be able to be here because, of course, your podcast is amazing. And you've been doing amazing work for a long time, which is really seminal for, places like Our Opinions Are Correct. Like we wouldn't be able to do this without the work that you guys are doing. So thank you for making this timeline better.
Yeah, we tried. It's complicated, and I'm so excited at how much more of this stuff, like how much more feminist media and criticism and debate and like the rigor of the intellectual sort of stimulation we're getting from engaging with just like the geekiest shit, and why that's so important is so much more common and easy to access for people. So, This timeline's not the worst. It's not the best either.
Yeah, no timeline is ever perfect.
Sure. All right, so let's actually just get right into this. To prompt us into this discussion, talking about timeline is a really powerful fictional device. It's been around for a long time, and it allows creators to shine a light on the cultural struggles and social ills of the present by making powerful connections with the past, and by offering wonderful or horrifying visions of the future. It can also just be super fun and wacky, and we've all seen those episodes. But time travel is uniquely powerful as a tool for feminist writers because feminism has always fought to prevent women's contributions from being written out of history. Time travel allows for stories in which women struggle, not just to gain power, but to regain their place in time itself. This topic is really interesting, and this sort of framing is really interesting, too, because of the book that Ebony and I wrote, History versus Women, where we were really just trying to be like, hey, there are all these women who have done amazing things that you don't know anything about. And so we want to share those stories and excavate those stories and bring them to the forefront. And in this fictional space, bringing out, like, really trying to show these spaces where women have, like, not been able to participate or who are forcing themselves into these spaces is really, I think, powerful for us narratively.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's interesting because I write both fiction and nonfiction, and there's certain stories that you can tell in fiction, even if they're kind of lies, that wind up, I think, having the effect that we wish our nonfiction would. And what I mean is that it's a truth telling mechanism, and it is a way of reminding people, say, that there were famous women leading movements in history, and their memories have been erased. And that was certainly when I was starting work on my novel. That was something that was really it just felt like a knife in my heart at that point. It was like early 2017. And I was thinking a lot about everything from how women get erased from Wikipedia to I had been writing a lot about archaeology, and I was thinking a lot about how Sappho got horribly fucked over in history. It was everything from, modern day erasure to, the ancient world erasure. Because, in ancient Greece, Sappho was considered to be one of the two greatest poets in history. It was Homer and Sappho. You ask any Greek on the street who cared about poetry, and they would say, yeah, for sure, Sappho, one of the two greatest. And it was during the Middle Ages when a bunch of white dudes were deciding which books should be transcribed and which books should be retained that we lost Sappho's writing, but somehow managed to keep Homer's writing, which is lovely. I'm not no diss on Homer, right? It's just that he was one of two, and surprise, he was the one whose work survived. And I think this is the kind of thing that happens all the time in kind of the long view of history and then the very short view of history, where constantly women are winking out on Wikipedia due to their lack of notability.
I feel like that story is so common that and we don't even understand how common it is because those stories have been erased, right? Like I was doing research for the book, Lois Weber was one of the women that we wrote about, and she was a very prolific, prominent filmmaker in the early days of film, and her name was a household name along with people like Cecil B. DeMille. But we don't even know who she is today. And even in her lifetime, she was forgotten. Like, it actually happened really quickly. And so it's so startling. I actually, before we go too far, I do want, if you could just explain roughly the concept of your book, because I think that's really relevant to this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, Wikipedia does kind of form a kind of metaphorical frame because the way that time travel is talked about in the novel is as a series of edits to history. There's one timeline, so it's not a multiverse, it's a single monoverse, I suppose. And there's a group of feminist time travelers who are academics and who are kind of pretending to be doing research in history, but are actually trying to change history. And so they have a lot of debates over how history works, how social change works. And at the same time, they discover that they are in an edit war with a group of men who are trying to eradicate women who have been important in history, as well as eradicate women's rights. And so they are literally editing and re-editing and reverting the timeline, and that's the language they use for it. And to me, that was a really interesting way to think about history. And there are a lot of real life historical figures in the novel whose stories I wanted to tell. And I also think that it's really key to have characters in a single timeline when you're telling this kind of story, because it means that all of the consequences of their actions are things that they ultimately have to face. So they can't just kind of go back in time and like branch another timeline and create like a happy feminist world and like leave everybody else behind. They have to constantly be returning to the present and dealing with what happens if one of their edits gets reverted and things get worse, or if one of their edits takes and things get a little bit better, they get to kind of reap the benefits of that. And so the story is partly about that sort of high level stuff of like, how does history work and how do we change the timeline and how do we crush our enemies in the time war, in the edit war. But it's also about a teenage girl who is stuck in time. She's just living in regular old real time, and in the early 90s in an abusive family and is trying to figure out how to survive and get out. And her life crisscrosses the life of this time traveler in these mysterious ways. And that's part of the pleasure of the book, is finding out, why is this time traveler visiting her? What's their connection? And in the meantime, this girl who's living in the early 90s, Beth, discovers that her best friend is murdering guys who are rapists. So there's a lot going on. This is the kind of thing that happens when you grow up in the suburbs of Orange County. Is just, sometimes you just got to murder some guys. And
I mean, we all have that friend, right? I mean, we all have that friend who's done that, at least.
Yeah.
Right?
We've all been there.
Yeah.
So So there's a lot of different choices that the women are making, and how they're trying to intervene in history. And so we kind of get a chance to peek at all of these different efforts to make things better for women and see how they turn out over the long track of history.
So it was. I was thinking before this episode, before we started recording, about like, when was it that I first became aware of like time travel narratives as something that could really engage with, issues of like, say, social justice and things. And it's funny, like, because the thing that sticks out in my mind, that I grew up with, is the TV show Quantum Leap, right? Where each week,
yes,
he'd be put in these situations to put right what once went wrong. I think the opening narrator, the narrator said. But like, I remember that there was like one episode, I think, at least one episode in which he leaped into, the life of a woman, and it was like a big deal that the show was doing this, right? I mean, Scott Bakula was like, he went on the Tonight Show and walked around in heels and stuff. It was like this gimmicky.
Are you serious?
Yeah, absolutely. It was like this
God.
big, it was like a very special episode kind of thing, And I mean, so you have a woman whose life experience has gone wrong, and he's there to set it right. But obviously, we, the viewers, see a man. And what was especially like strange, or looking back on it, didn't seem strange at the time, but looking back on it now, it seems strange. So the character was like some kind of secretary, in some sort of male-dominated office, and there was one womanizing, or one guy who was like sexually harassing her constantly. And there's this big like gotcha moment where Sam, I think the main character's name is, like, pushes back at like the end of the episode. Is supposed to be this big like satisfying thing, but like what Sam says to this womanizing boss figure is basically something like the payoff of it was like, I am a man. Like, and so that's where the power resides, was that in the role of this woman, like, Sam was asserting that person was also a quote unquote man. And like, now looking back, and I'm like, oh my God, like, even in this narrative that's supposed to kind of be dealing with, women's plight and women's like issues and things, like, that was how the writers figured to kind of have this like payoff gotcha audience satisfaction moment of like sticking it to the sexual harasser, abuser figure. Anyway, so yeah, it's just interesting, like, what a rare and radical act almost it is to still kind of center women in these stories in ways that actually lift up women, you know what I mean? As opposed to just reifying patriarchy or something.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you brought up Quantum Leap, because it really, like, when that show was airing, I was a teenager, I guess, and a friend of mine who had kind of come out to us as trans, but not to anyone else, it became her favorite show, because she felt like it was basically the only place that you could see stuff like that, even as it was sort of undermining itself.
Yeah.
And
it had that appeal for me as well. I don't think I processed it consciously in those terms, but I think that was probably part of the fascination the show had for me as well.
It's interestingly a kind of at the origins of these time travel stories. I mean, if we can say the origins is in the early 20th century, or in the early to mid 20th century, because one of the most famous time travel stories is a Robert Heinlein story called All You Zombies, which kind of creates the bootstrap paradox. And it's about a guy who goes back in time and becomes his own mother and father. And it involves the character having a sex change, which is how they would have, what they would refer to it at the time.
Right.
And that was like a twist, because it was like transgender identity is like so unexpected. Nobody expects the transgender identity. And so that became a film really recently called Predestination, which is actually pretty damn good. That has a character, it has an actor playing both the male and female role, and it's handled in a much better way. It's not sort of like surprise. It's it's actually, there's a lot of scenes that are kind of amazing where the character is talking to herself and reassuring herself. But my point is that something about time travel kind of ticks this box in our brains or punches this button that makes us think about how gender is fluid for whatever reason. Because once time becomes fluid, gender becomes fluid. And I'm not sure what it is that makes this incredibly patriarchal, crappy guy like Heinlein have that realization. But he did. And I think it has influenced a lot of time travel stories to sort of inspire authors to think about not just time, but identity.
Oh, interesting. I mean, unless it's Doctor Who, in which case he can't look at gender in Doctor Who.
No, finally, we're allowed to.
Yeah. Well, and so I was, as you proposed this topic, I was like thinking about time travel and like social justice-y things, because there's so many time travel narratives. Like Terminator is one of the first ones I went to in my brain, which is like stop the robots and go, or whatever. They're robots. It's fine. Skynet, that's the word I'm looking for. But going back in time and doing all that, but like the ones that actually, when I read your book, I was like, this feels so unique to me. It feels so, I feel like it felt very unique and timely in a way that a lot of other books that I read that are political don't, in that it was so explicitly about feminism. It was so explicitly about men's rights activism, like what that would look like in a time where you can travel back and forth. Like I thought it was really funny that you called them the Comstockers. That's what you called them, right? I'm not making that
Yes,
up.
they are.
Okay.
They get their name from this 19th century moralist, Anthony Comstock, who had a tremendous effect on our obscenity laws for at least 100 years after his death. And he's the guy who basically made it possible for Congress to classify any information about abortion and birth control as obscene materials, which meant that people who were mailing information, just sex education information through the mail could be arrested and sent to prison. And he was also famous for, busting abortionists in New York City where he lived. So he was an incredible shitbag. And his rhetoric is so incredibly similar to the rhetoric that you see in men's rights forums now.
And a lot of the like, there's a lot of one-to-one of the sort of anti-feminist, anti-suffrage propaganda that was happening in the early 1900s, or that sort of general time period, that is so similar to how they talk today, or have been talking for the last several decades, that I was like, oh, of course you focused on this time period and that person as a marker here, which was really, and the effects that were happening to the women in those movements during that time, because that was a big sort of, it wasn't called feminism then, but it was a big feminist movement and time period in this country's history, at least, right? But so as I was thinking about like what other ones, I went back to Octavia Butler's Kindred, which was the first book I ever read of hers, and I think it does something very similar in terms of really forcing us to reckon with our history, and what it means for these stories of like, what does it mean for certain bodies to go back in time, right? Like the joke is always, unless you're a white dude, why would you ever go back in time, right? It would be terrible for you. And so Kindred is a story about a woman in LA in 1976 who gets thrown back into pre-Civil War Maryland and is like forced to be a slave because she's a Black woman in this time. And so she kind of keeps getting sucked back and forth between time. And it's such a brilliant reckoning with that juxtaposition, in addition to all of the other sort of messaging and politics of the beauty of Octavia Butler's work and of what she was trying to do with that book.
Yeah, I'm tremendously influenced by Octavia Butler. I think all of her work is so seminal to feminist science fiction and science fiction generally. I mean, it's not just about feminism. And I think the thing that's also super interesting about Kindred is she's tweaking this common trope, the grandfather paradox trope, which is something that like white dudes are really obsessed with. It's the trope at the heart of Back to the Future, which is that if you go back in time, you could prevent your own birth from happening. Like if you accidentally shoot your grandfather somehow, you will not be born, right? So this is the paradox of time travel. And it's in Kindred, she's having to go back in time and prevent her white slave owning ancestor from dying so that she can be born. And so it's, I think, just such a powerful way of thinking about the interconnectedness of slave owners and slaves, and how this history that we all share is based on, these relationships of power and domination and slavery, and also love and family. And it's such a hard balance to maintain in a novel, to think about all of those things at once, because it's a challenge to be not just
Yeah.
saying like, this guy is horrible, but I have to save him because he's my ancestor. And
Right.
she just does. I mean, that's Octavia Butler in every novel. She always manages to complicate everything and give us incredibly nuanced pictures of how these people are dealing with power relations. And anyway,
And
I'm in awe of that book.
I mean, I can't believe how incredible of an author she is and how wide ranging her narratives are as well, right? Like she's not just like, I write in this one genre. It's just like, holy shit, how do you make these worlds happen?
Yeah.
But what I liked, one of the things I really liked in your book too was the idea you really suss out, or you're trying to get people thinking about activism, and time travel is a really great way of doing that, because you're talking about like, is it one person, is it the movement, is it collective action, is it individual action? Like all of these questions arise as we're going through, following the story, like following the activists, on sort of, you're not following the Comstockers, but you kind of are seeing what they're doing versus what these like academic women are doing in this space. And that's a question we ask today, obviously. Like that's part of why I think the book resonates, is like we're trying to figure out what collective action means, how we make real change today, to fight for social justice and create space away from tyranny and oppression.
Yeah, I think one of the frustrations I've always had with time travel stories, as much as I love them, is that they tend to get hung up on questions like the grandfather paradox or the causal loop or butterfly effect. And you don't see a lot of people thinking about just how do you actually change history if you want to? Not how do you
Mm.
avoid it or how do you create a paradox, but like, how do you actually make things different? And that was why I really wanted to focus on kind of the main philosophical difference or philosophical debate in the book is between people who believe that great men control history. So that history is basically a series of dudes leading wars, leading nations, leading movements, and that if you take away those men, those movements go away. It's kind of the if you kill Hitler, you avoid World War II school of thought. And then there's the feminists who believe in collective action and believe that you can't change history or the present unless you have many, many people working together, sometimes not even realizing that they're working together. Women who are spread apart by time, spread apart by space, but are still connected to the same project of social justice, basically. And of course, it turns out that the collective action theory is correct. But
Yeah.
it's a little bit more. It's
Yeah,
a
it
little
is.
bit more nuanced than that. I wanted to allow for the fact that obviously we can never know for sure how history has changed,
Yeah.
but collective action, especially across time, is such an appealing idea to me.
I brought up Doctor Who
And I
earlier.
think
Oh,
that,
sorry, Carol.
oh, no, go ahead.
No, you please.
Okay. I mean, I think that time travel stories in general just have such a potential or a power for making us in the present aware of how our lives are very much part of these like ongoing struggles. I mean, I've been thinking a lot lately about like like labor movements and yeah, like worker action and things like that, which I grew up when going to public school in the US, like not learning really much of anything whatsoever about labor movements and capitalism and socialism and things like that. And so when in these past kind of 10, 15 years, as I've embraced, kind of leftist politics and felt these struggles very much in my own life, it sort of felt like, oh, this is just something new, right? But like, lately, like on Twitter and things, I've been seeing, my friend Scott Benson, who's a big, leftist labor rights champion, has been sharing these like cartoons and things about labor action and from like 100 years ago, and they feel like in a way like they could have been written today. Like the things that the characters in these cartoons are saying are like so immediate and so alive and so relevant right now. And seeing them is like it's kind of like invigorating and like making me feel contextualized in this ongoing story, whereas before I sort of felt isolated, cut off, like, oh, this is just something that's like emerged from nowhere and is like happening now. And I think that I don't know, I feel like this was an experience I had with the David Mitchell book Cloud Atlas, which isn't exactly a time travel narrative, but it does jump back and forth in time a lot, which it just, it made me feel so connected to a larger narrative of human history and like a small but a small but meaningful drop in an ocean as opposed to this like isolated thing. And yeah, I feel like there are ways in which our education systems, our cultural narratives fail us and don't really help us feel connected to bigger things. And science fiction and maybe time travel narratives in particular can kind of, in some ways, fill that gap and open our eyes to the ways in which we are part of these larger struggles that have been going on for who knows how long.
Yeah, I think that's really true.
I feel like also time travel, I don't know if this, well, let me know what you think of this. Like, time travel is impossible in a way that like feels like it will always be impossible. It's not to say that it will always be impossible, but it feels like it's always going to be impossible, right? So I think that there's something different about time travel narratives than say like traveling in space and having a colony on the moon and like where that feels attainable in the future. I feel like our sense of how we connect with these different genres or these different sort of specifics of sci-fi change the way that we can and think about and approach these arenas. Does that make sense? I don't know if that's fully fleshed out, but
No, I think that's really true. And actually, because I am a science journalist, my first impulse when I started the book was to try to have the most scientifically plausible time travel that there would be, right? So, which I somehow thought there was one. And so I called up. Yeah, well, I mean, I was like, I don't know, there could be a thing. So I called up Sean Carroll, who's a physicist down at Caltech, and he studies cosmology. And so he's the guy I call when I have questions about time travel. And he was like, look, this is not science. It's a literary device, and you should use it as a literary device. I mean, he gave me some, kind of cover stories. He's like, sure, use wormholes, that's fine because we don't really know how those work. So, he did give me like a pass, but he basically was like, look, that's what time travel really is it's about, it's the humanities. And I think that's why, again, Wikipedia is such a good way of thinking about time travel because it's all about how we each are revising history every day, every second. And that's how
Mm-hmm.
we travel through time, is by looking back and remembering things in history or erasing things from history.
Yeah, I mean,
Absolutely.
one of the fun things about time travel is that if you, to me anyway, as a reader and viewer and consumer of science fiction, is that like if you need time travel in your story, you can sort of just like come up with any, like Star Trek 4. Oh, we'll slingshot around the sun. That'll do it. It's like it doesn't really even
Superman
matter
will like
so much.
zoom around the Earth,
Yeah, or whatever.
all
Like, it doesn't
good.
really matter how you do it. You can just like, because it's so in that realm of the impossible, it kind of frees you up to offer up almost any way to make it work in your story that you want, right? There's almost like a kind of liberation there in a way, right? Because it's not something that we need to root in like hard science. Although it can be fascinating to do that, to explore like, well, what would time travel actually be like if it were a real thing? There's also the fun of just like, oh, you have to be going exactly 88 miles per hour when the lightning bolt strikes, or whatever. Like, it can be fun to do that too.
Yeah. I feel like also, I was thinking about recently, the new Doctor Who had 2 episodes in particular that I felt were like the sort of like social justice-y episodes, right? And this is a bigger conversation that we already had about how sort of disappointing I thought that this season was. But in a way, it was obviously them trying to be like, we care about like these issues that are affecting people today, and we're like making a very clear stand. So there's 2 episodes. One was about Rosa Parks, that took place in Alabama in 1955, and the other one was Demons of the Punjab, which was about the partition of India in 1947. And I feel like something like Doctor Who, which is like a kids show, but like probably one of the most famous time travel shows, like. Yeah, I would say probably. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm
I
saying
think that's
probably.
fair
It
enough.
is. It's fair. It's a fair thing. I feel like those are often about like, they feel a little more educational. Like they're a little less ambitious in, say, like what you're doing, where it's like asking deep questions about time travel. I feel like it's more like, oh, this introduced a whole new generation to this history of India and Pakistan and like religious conflict that they've never seen before or heard of before outside of that region or outside of that history, right? And I think that there's something interesting about that, just as like an educational tool, where it's us going there and being like, oh shit, our perspective today on what's happening, what does that look like? And that's like, to me, that's also kind of Wikipedia, right? Like it's a fictionalized way of reading history if it's done right.
I think that's right. Yeah. And I mean, the Doctor in Doctor Who almost never is trying to change history. Usually the Doctor is just visiting history or has some kind of side mission, like it's
Exactly.
like, oh, well, we're at the partition of India, but I'm really here to deal with like a family melodrama, or it's not about like, actually maybe we could stop the partition. Like nobody asks that question in
No.
Doctor Who. There's
Totally.
never, and I mean, I think partly that's because it's outside the moral scope of the show, because once you start changing history, then you do really, the show has to become like The Good Place, where like every episode is like another ethical dilemma,
And could you
which I
imagine
love.
keeping track of that canon? Like, Jesus Christ.
Yes.
Fuck. But also like the imagining, like this also opens up like history. We know history, although history is recorded by certain people with certain perspectives. And so we do get to provide alternative views into what we consider to be like historical fact, or different perspectives of that, as we've seen with things like when the Viking bones were excavated or were found to be female, when for years and decades they were thought to be male, and like tools are thought to be weapons because there was a certain lens that they were viewed with, and later on they were like, no, they were cooking implements. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there, but also imagining the future and what that looks like. And what I thought was really interesting, and if this is spoilery, I will cut it out, but in your book you have these machines that have existed And so that inherently is a different timeline than one that we know. And that the interaction with those machines over time has to change those cultures in some ways.
Yep, that was what was fun for me is I think the first idea I had for the book was what would it be like to live in a heavily edited timeline, which is the timeline we live in basically. I mean, we live in a timeline, we live in a world where we're constantly editing our own history. So it really is bewildering. Like kids who grew up in the 50s learning about US history like literally learned about a different history than I did when I was growing up. And so yeah, I have this idea of these devices which are being used as time machines by humans on that are ancient, like they're half a billion years old. They're kind of people have discovered them on Earth, and they discovered them thousands of years ago, kind of at the dawn of civilization. And people have been using them for thousands and thousands of years, and they've been changing little things all along. There's all these rules about how you're not supposed to change things, but people are doing it anyway. And there's 5 time machines, and they're located all over the world. So there's one in Timbuktu, there's one in Australia. And so there's different kinds of interventions taking place depending on the kind of country that you're in. And so it's a fun way of thinking about how, as we change history, we get into a slightly alternate timeline. And so the novel is in a slightly alternate timeline where actually things are a little bit better for feminist pop culture than they are in our timeline. It's a subtle change. But like Tim Burton made Wonder Woman movies in the 90s instead of making Batman movies, for example. And the Riot Girl scene where Beth hangs out is intersectional in a way that the Riot Girl scene was not when I was in it. It was very white. And or at least the bands that were promoted the most were white. There were plenty of bands with POC. It was just not, those were not the bands that kind of got plucked out of obscurity.
I gotta say, it was really disturbing to read this book when I first started because I was like, wait, how did you know about my teenage years? Like some of the same locations, like the music, like just I was like, wait, I didn't murder people, but like everything else is pretty dead on.
The book is very autobiographical. It's set in Irvine, California, where I grew up. And I also didn't murder anyone, but I definitely thought about it. So,
Sure.
It's true to my fantasy life for sure.
Yeah.
And it was really funny when you told me that because I was like, oh, I kept wondering as I was writing it, like, will anybody from Irvine or Orange County read this and know how frickin' accurate this is? Or
yeah, like so accurate for people who read it and are just like, oh, whatever, suburbs. I'm like, no, you clearly lived this life because I was like, Jesus.
There's Woodbridge Lake and Knollwood's hamburger restaurant. And so, yeah.
Yeah, totally. I want to ask a last question of both of you. If you could travel back in time anywhere to any time, where would you go? It's like this might be too hard to answer on the spot, but
well, I mean, to go back to our earlier comment, like as a trans woman, I'm not really inclined to go back to any earlier time. But if it were purely like, let's say that all of my concerns are, it would be purely like a tourism kind of or for fun, and I wouldn't have to worry about any of the actual kind of oppressions or those kinds of ramifications. Oh gosh. I mean, I hate to be kind of, I guess probably like, I don't know, like Renaissance Paris or something to be kind of obvious, but I think it would probably be really just interesting to observe and be around, in that place and time, I guess, that's my answer.
I feel like you feel very self-conscious about your answer, but I think that's perfectly
Well, I
reasonable
feel like
answer.
I wish I had a better answer. And
Sure.
I feel like maybe, because I haven't really given this much thought, and I feel like maybe I'll have a better answer 20 minutes from now when we're not talking about this anymore. But that's my answer
that's
right
how
now.
it always goes.
I think that's a good answer. I was just thinking about how awesome it would be to visit the Renaissance, like pretty much anywhere in Europe. It would have been kind of fun, as long as, of course, we could pass as white dudes, and that would be fine. or just be tourists. But I think like for me, so I have to confess that part of the pleasure of this book was that I had been writing a bunch of nonfiction about archaeology, and I'm in the middle of a book about ancient abandoned cities. That's a nonfiction book,
Ooh.
and
Wow.
it's super fun, but incredibly frustrating because one of the cities, which is probably my favorite in the book, is Cahokia, which was an indigenous city in East St. Louis about 1,000 years ago. It was really quite populous about 1,000 years ago. It was the largest city in North America at that time. And it's on the Mississippi, so it was connected to a big network of other cities and villages and towns. And it had huge mounds that were basically the size of the pyramids at Giza in terms of their footprint. They weren't quite as tall, but they are these sort of packed earth mounds where they would have rituals on top and stuff. It's fucking amazing. And it was built entirely with perishable materials. So if they had writing, which they probably had some kind of writing, none of it survives. We have no information about who lived there, what languages they spoke. There aren't any oral histories. The city was abandoned long before Europeans arrived. So it's not like the Europeans came and kind of wrote down dumb things about them before killing them. It was just, it
God.
was already lost. I mean, I'm just saying that's kind of
No,
how it
it's
works.
true. I'm like, our
For-
history is so horrifying.
I know.
Fuck.
So my destination would be in my happy world where I can just do whatever in time. I want to go back to Cahokia around the year 1000 and hopefully speak the language and just find out what the hell they were doing, like what their belief systems were, like, have some barbecue with them. Barbecue is really big at Cahokia. Like a lot of the remains we
Fuck
find are
yeah.
like giant barbecue feasts. So I would go have a barbecue, shoot the breeze, and then come back.
That sounds amazing. That's a really good answer. Sorry, Carol.
I've been thinking about
No,
this a lot.
I agree. I'm like, wow, I wish I had something like that.
You can come
I'm
with
changing
me.
my plans. I'm also going to Cahokia. Either that or I've changed my mind or back to like prehistoric ages so that I can see dinosaurs
Oh.
and step on a butterfly by accident and change the whole fate of the whole course of history by accidentally killing a butterfly.
The butterfly effect.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, if you want to just go back to the Neolithic, I highly recommend this novella by Kelly Robeson called Gods, Monsters, and the Lucky Peach. Just came out, and it's about going back to the Neolithic to get environmental samples to figure out what the planet was like before the
Ooh.
Anthropocene. And
Uh-huh.
it's delightful. It's like full of queer characters. There's a woman who's like half octopus. It's like freaking
Sure.
great. So
Wow.
let's go there. She goes back to Mesopotamia. So
Oh, that sounds cool. Yeah.
I always think about time travel, and I think about if we go back not that far back, everyone's gotta smell so bad, right? Like you'd really have to get used to just like the smell of people.
it's true. I actually, when I was researching this book, I read an entire article about the smells in Neolithic villages, and this scholar was like, "Yeah, it would have smelled like poop and a lot of other bad stuff."
Mm-hmm.
Oh, totally. I think that I would have such a hard time picking something. So my mind kind of goes more personal in that I am really sad that I can never see where my parents grew up because it's in northern Iraq and it's been destroyed many times over. So like just being able to see that village in those towns, or also like, and this is also more sad family history, but like where my grandparents lived before the Armenian genocide, like the part of Armenia that is occupied by present day Turkey, and how like that whole place is completely different now. Culturally and everything, but like how interesting it would be to be able to witness like that, like what life was like there, because I only get bits and pieces of it from oral histories that are passed down through family and stuff like that. So I think that would probably be where I'd go. But I'm also like, man, like the what about seeing something like the great library in Alexandria? Like those sorts of like these monumental places of knowledge and these huge epic like untarnished spaces that have been commercialized now or whatever, just like being able to witness it for even like 5 minutes I think would be so incredible. So yeah, I don't have a good answer, but
I think those were both great answers. I think one of the things that we didn't get to talk about very much was the fact that a lot of more recent time travel stories are very personal, kind of like your wish to go back and see Armenia before it was decimated. And I think that's a kind of a characteristic of a lot of the kind of feminist and anti-racist time travel stories that are coming out now. Like, for example, um, I think that you could argue the recent novella "This Is How You Lose the Time War" by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone is kind of it's a love story and a time travel war story, and they never forget, even as they're telling these kind of epic like battles that cross thousands of years. It's also about this interpersonal relationship and how they kind of go back and visit each other's childhoods, and it's very intimate and personal. And Mike Chen has this fantastic novel called Here and Now and Then, which is like super exciting, like time travel agent on a mission. Like it's very kind of techno thrillery, but the whole arc of the novel is really about him trying to rescue his daughter from this kind of terrible fate that he's seen in the future. And it's not a cheesy sort of like Liam Neeson rescuing his daughter from terrorists kind of narrative. It's like his daughter is a fully realized character. We understand this sort of family connection they have is feels very real and lived in, and it's about him wanting to be a good dad, like in a sort of like I want to cook my daughter dinner way, not I want to shoot a bunch of guns way. So
oh, that's awesome.
it's so fantastic, and it's like it's this giant sprawling time travel story, but it's also this really intimate look at like family and how we want to stay connected to our families. So I
Nice.
can't recommend it enough.
We will link all those recommendations and books in the show notes. Let's take a quick break and we'll be back with our weekly freak out.
Hey, Feminist Frequency Radio listeners, why not join our Patreon community at patreon.com/femfreak? Seriously, what are you waiting for? Hey everyone, it's me, Carolyn. I'm sorry to say that Anita has been sucked into a time vortex. She's probably currently fending off dinosaurs in the prehistoric. Who knows? But I'm going to be seeing us through the rest of this journey here. And as you know, if you're a regular listener, now it's time for us to talk about what's been thrilling us, moving us, upsetting us, or infuriating us this past week. Annalee, what are you freaking out about these days?
I am freaking out about artificial intelligence, as we all are.
Yes.
And specifically, I am freaking out about a blog called AIweirdness.com, which was created by Janelle Shane, who is an amazing AI programmer in her spare time, in her copious spare time. She creates neural networks to demonstrate how bad AI is.
Ooh.
And she's been doing this for a couple of years. You may have seen her work floating around on Twitter when she did a paint name generator.
Oh, I think I did actually see that. Yes.
Yeah, so she's done everything from recipes to game rules. And what she does is she uses a really standard neural network, which is just a machine learning algorithm, and feeds it a bunch of information. And like she'll feed it a bunch of recipes or she'll feed it a bunch of paint colors, and it will try to come up with its own based on what it's learned from this data and also from a large data set of information from the internet. So it's not a drift. It's got the whole internet in its brain, as well as these prompts that come from different sources. So the results are hilarious, and she has a book coming out in November, which is called, the book was named by her neural net.
Oh my God.
And the title of the book is "You Look Like a Thing and I Love You."
Aww.
And it's amazing.
That's
And it's
so heartwarming.
Yeah, it is, right? And so the thing that's great about the book is it's incredibly funny, but also it's a great way to actually learn about how artificial intelligence really works. And so she'll teach you a little bit about how it works and then show you about how weird it is and how it's pretty far away from taking over the planet. It's really just sort of struggling to understand how to even put words together in a way that aren't silly. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. And so you'll come away from the book and from her blog knowing a lot more about AI and giggling hysterically. So I highly recommend that you head over to aiweirdness.com. And her book is coming in November, and it has a lot of cute illustrations in it, as well as being very informative.
That sounds utterly delightful and fascinating. So I'm freaking out about, well, I'm freaking out on multiple levels, most of them not good, about the new Quentin Tarantino film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which has so much going on in it and is so, it's a genuinely fascinating film, I think, and I feel like we here at FFR could fill 5 episodes talking about various aspects of this film. But for the sake of this freak out, I want to just focus on one in particular. And this is relatively spoiler free, I think. So if you're listening and you haven't seen the film yet, don't worry. This isn't going to in any way, I don't think, affect your experience. But you may know that there's a cameo in the film by an actor playing Bruce Lee, and this scene, there's one particular scene in which Bruce Lee is featured pretty heavily, and when I saw the film, I saw it in San Francisco, and there was a lot of laughter at Lee's expense, the character of Bruce Lee, the fictionalized version of him in this film, during the scene. And, I came out of the film kind of troubled about the portrayal of Bruce Lee in this film. And certainly a lot of people, family members of Bruce Lee have objected very strongly to the portrayal of him in the film and everything. But I want to specifically, mention one thing that's kind of complicated my feelings around the conversation around the portrayal of Bruce Lee in the film, and that is that there's a film critic who I admire a lot. His name is Walter Chaw. He's a Chinese American. I mean, he's an American of Chinese descent, and he has argued that the real problem with the handling of with the Bruce Lee scene is the ways in which white Americans have been conditioned to see certain things about Bruce Lee as sort of inherently ridiculous, like that the racism is at least largely in what people are bringing to the film with them. To the he and I'll link in our show notes to a piece he wrote for Vulture about the whole discourse around the portrayal of Bruce Lee. He talks about being bullied as a young person growing up in Colorado, and how white kids would sort of make stereotypical mocking Bruce Lee noises as part of their racist taunting of him. And so he basically is saying that. And this is not, I'm not trying to defend Tarantino or defend the portrayal of Bruce Lee in the film, but I do think that it's interesting to think about how there's more to it than just what's happening on the screen. That I think there is at least some degree of the laughter, or that is maybe happening in audiences during the scene is because audience members, white audience members particularly, have learned to see certain things about, say, Bruce Lee that may be authentic to some degree, to imbue them with a kind of ridiculousness and view them through a racist lens. And so I just wanted to, I don't know, it's just been a conversation that's been rattling around in my head a lot. It's kind of, challenged the way that, my initial reactions to the scene and to the film. And so I just wanted to amplify that a bit and link that. And so, as I said, I will link that in the show notes because, I think it's an interesting perspective that more people should read. I thought it was a very interesting argument and an interesting piece. So.
Yeah, a lot of people have been talking about that scene. And I mean, Tarantino's had this long history of having a weird relationship with, not just Bruce Lee, but like sort of his whole cinematic history. And I mean, Kill Bill is basically like one giant appropriation of Bruce Lee, which never really mentions Bruce Lee, which is what makes it kind of appropriation as opposed to an homage, which I think Tarantino wanted it to be an homage, but he failed.
Yes.
So I mean, I'm curious to see the film. I definitely will see it, but I've heard a lot of mixed things about that scene and how it's kind of, it's complex.
It is complex. It certainly is. And, I have so many criticisms of the film, but I also can't stop thinking about it. And, there's a weird way in which I value a complex work, even one that has problematic elements, sometimes over a work that is overly neat and pat and simple, which this film certainly is not that. Anyway, my feelings about the movie, as I said, are so complicated, and I could go on for episodes and episodes about it, but anyway.
For the future.
Yes, exactly. You, our wonderful FFR listeners, can submit your own freak-out at feministfrequency.com/freakout. We'd love to hear what you're freaking out about this week. All right, everyone, thank you so much for listening to FFR. Stay tuned for the Freakin' After Party, which is only available to backers of this podcast, which you can be. Learn more at patreon.com/femfreak. Hey, Annalee, if people want to know more about you or maybe want to pre-order your book, where should they go? Where can they do that?
Well, thanks for asking. If you want to find my book, which is called The Future of Another Timeline, you can find it at IndieBound or any of the other places online that sell books, or you can go to your local indie bookseller and ask them to pull a copy for you when it comes in.
You can find us everywhere great podcasts are found. If you haven't yet, please go to iTunes and subscribe, rate, and review us. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and all the social medias at FemFreak. This show is engineered by Rob Pera. Sarah Norales provides technical support. Artwork is by Jamie Varon, and our intro music is by Phil Circus. Join us next week for another feminist dive into pop culture. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.